Hi, I'm Penny Carlson, and this is Topics in Digital Photography. Do you know the easiest way for a photographer to make money? Sell all their gear. I admit it, I'm addicted to buying camera equipment, and fortunately I can afford it because I have a day job. Today we're going to talk about different types of digital cameras, and we'll talk about what kind of digital camera might be right for you. Okay, I've organized my gear a little bit and pared it down to just the cameras so we can go over types of digital cameras, although I do have an old film camera here that we'll take a look at. And I'll help you figure out what kind of camera to buy if you don't have one and what's appropriate for this class. First of all, let's just talk about what's appropriate for the class. All you need for the class is to have a camera that'll shoot in manual mode. And generally, if it's got a mode dial on it, you'll be able to use it for the class. So let's take a look at a couple of these cameras with the mode dials. Here's a shot of both my DSLR and my bridge camera, and you can see that they have a traditional mode dial. Most mode dials will have the following settings. They'll have an M, which means manual mode, and in manual mode you set both your shutter speed and your aperture. They'll have an A for aperture priority. The aperture is the lens opening, and it controls the amount of light that comes in and hits the sensor. In aperture priority, you set the aperture and the camera chooses a shutter speed that'll give you the correct exposure. You also have shutter priority, which is usually either S or it's TB on Canon mode dials. And in shutter priority, you set the shutter speed and the camera will choose an aperture that gives you the correct amount of exposure. Most cameras also have several automatic modes, including a P or program mode. And the program mode will let you control certain features like ISO. And then most cameras will have various scene modes. The scene modes are an automatic setting where you choose the type of scene that you're shooting and the camera chooses the settings that it thinks will give you the best picture. Some cameras, like this little mirrorless Sony, have a virtual mode dial. And this camera will work just fine for the course. You can see it's got the manual mode and it's got the aperture priority and shutter speed. Those are the three main settings we'll use on our camera during the course. Cameras have changed a lot since I started teaching this course in spring 2015. And one of the biggest changes is how much better mirrorless cameras have become. In fact, I now recommend mirrorless cameras to somebody that's going out and wants to buy their first advanced camera with interchangeable lenses. And you can see this is a mirrorless camera. We'll talk a little bit more about them. You can put different lenses on it. And to tell you the truth, this camera, even though it's pretty small, has all the features. Well, this is a very expensive DSLR, but it's got all the features that DSLR in the same price range would have. In fact, generally the mirrorless cameras tend to have a lot more features in the same price range. This camera is a Sony Nex-5T. It's a little older model, but it's one I highly recommend if you don't want to spend too much money on a camera. You should be able to go out on eBay and find this camera with a lens for about $300, maybe even $250, $275 with this nice little compact lens. And this will take just as good pictures as your entry-level big DSLRs from Canon and Nikon. And it actually has quite a few more features than the entry-level Canon and Nikon cameras. Some of the features that I really like on newer cameras are that you can control them with your camera phone. For example, this camera has that feature, and you won't find it on the entry-level Canons and Nikons. This camera will connect wirelessly to your phone. You can set the camera up on a tripod, and you can just use your phone to actually focus with this particular camera. You can even zoom the lens So I can set it up, for example, out by my bird feeder, walk away, and use my phone to focus and take the picture, and even zoom in and zoom out. So that kind of stuff is really cool. The other cool thing about newer cameras, some of the DSLRs have these features too, but you've got to go into more expensive models where you tend to find features like this on entry-level mirrorless cameras. I'm a Sony fan, no question about that, and Sony's really packed the features into their lower-level cameras. If you want to find comparable mirrorless cameras that are a little bit newer models, look at the Sony A5000, A5100, or a really fantastic camera, the Sony A6000. But then you're going to start spending quite a bit more money. The A5100 or A5000, sometimes you can find them on sale in the $300 to $400 price range. The other thing newer cameras will do is not only can you use your phone as a remote, but you can send pictures directly to your phone or to your computer without having to hook it up to your computer or take the card out and download your pictures that way. I don't find that quite as convenient, but if you're somebody that wants to shoot a picture and send it right off post it on Facebook, the new cameras do that really well. Let's talk a little bit about what a DSLR is and what the difference is between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera. And to start that conversation, I'm going to get out my old film camera. All right, let's take a look at the film camera and see how it works. This camera is an SLR, single lens reflex camera. And digital cameras are based on the same design. They're called DSLRs, digital single lens reflex cameras. So they're based on the same design as the single lens reflex camera. And that design is that the camera has a mirror on it. I don't really care if I get this one dirty, which is why I'm using my film camera. And what this mirror does is it reflects the scene from the lens, through the lens, back up into an optical viewfinder. Now it's nice because you see the same scene that the lens is seeing. But the downside of this mirror is that A, it's kind of big, and B, when the camera takes a picture, this mirror actually has to flip up and out of the way so that the camera can take the picture. You see, the film would be back in here on this, and then a digital camera or digital sensor is back in there. So this mirror has to flip up so that the light can actually pass through the lens and that the picture can be recorded either on film in this case or on the digital sensor, which is analogous to film in the DSLR. And I'm going to be a little more delicate with my DSLR, but we can take this off and we can see that the mirror is also there. Again, that mirror can flip up. The only difference really between an old SLR single lens reflex camera and the newer DSLRs in design, I mean, they've tweaked them a lot and they've gotten better and better over the years. But the only difference in the way they work is that the SLR records its image on film. The film has to be exposed and later developed. And the DSLR does it on a digital sensor. So the sensor is the same as film in a film camera. Now there's tons of advantages to that in that you can see your picture right after you've recorded it. You don't have to wait to develop it. And of course, cost. It costs money to buy film. It costs money to get film developed. With the DSLRs, you can erase the stuff that you don't want, keep the stuff you want. So it's really a great equalizer in photography. That was one of the big differences between a pro photographer and an amateur photographer, was a pro photographer could burn through 3 rolls of film when they went out and photographed something, and your amateur photographer really couldn't afford to do that. So I've got this mirrorless camera, which we can compare, and I've got it next to my SLR because I don't have a smaller DSLR, and this would be comparable to your entry-level DSLRs. Which this mirrorless camera is kind of a mid-level mirrorless camera. What the mirrorless camera did was it took out, let's take this lens off, was it took out the mirror, and what you see right there is just the sensor, or analogous to the film. So nothing has to pop up out of the way. And you can see it made the body a lot shallower because we don't have to put that mirror in it. An advantage of mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras is that they're much smaller than their DSLR counterparts, yet they still have a large sensor. A disadvantage can be that they may not have a viewfinder. Some of the smaller mirrorless cameras don't have a viewfinder, and you need to compose your picture using the LCD screen. If you've been using your camera phone, you'll be used to that, and most of the time it works just fine, but the LCD can be difficult to see in bright daylight. Here I have my Sony Nex-5T mirrorless camera next to my Sony A7S mirrorless camera, so we can do some comparisons. The Sony A7S is a very high-end mirrorless system, and you notice that it does have a viewfinder. The viewfinder is an electronic viewfinder rather than an optical viewfinder. The electronic viewfinder works the same way as the LCD on the back does. It projects the image directly from the camera's sensor to the viewfinder. Viewfinders can also be found on many bridge cameras, like this Panasonic Ultra Zoom bridge camera. Bridge cameras, point and shoots, and camera phones also don't have a mirror. We distinguish them from the mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras that I've been referring to as mirrorless cameras, in that these higher end cameras, you can remove the lens and put on different lenses depending on what your shooting needs are. When digital cameras first came out, the electronic viewfinders on them were horrible. They were fuzzy, low resolution, and it was impossible to see in low light. But now they've gotten a lot better. Some die-hard DSLR fans rave about optical viewfinders, but I actually prefer the electronic viewfinders. And the reason I prefer the electronic viewfinders is that all this information that's on your LCD, you can also put in the viewfinder if you want. So you can have a leveler in there if you need it. If you change your exposure, let's change our exposure a whole lot so we're really underexposing our shot. See how that screen goes dark? And you can actually tell that your picture's underexposed by looking at the screen, or you're going to see that darker underexposed image in the viewfinder too. I find that extremely helpful. The thing I really want to take a look at on these two cameras is the sensor size. When it comes to digital cameras, sensor size really matters. In fact, it matters a lot more than megapixels. Consumers get caught up in the megapixel wars, but in my mind, sensor size is the most important thing to look at when you're looking for a quality digital camera. This is a Sony A7S, and it's got what we call a full frame sensor. The Sony Nex-5T has a very standard DSLR type sensor called an APS-C sensor, and it's just a bit smaller than this full frame sensor. Most of you are probably shooting with cameras that have APS-C sensors. The Sony A7S is made to take pictures in extremely low light. To do this, they use a full frame sensor that's only 12 megapixels. Because the pixels are larger and able to gather more light. A larger sensor and big pixels results in much less noise in your final picture. Digital noise is a graininess that you tend to get in photos if you shoot at too high an ISO. The A7S, with its large sensor and large pixels, can easily shoot still scenes at around 10,000 ISO, and it can go even higher on video. With the camera phone, you're going to start seeing digital noise with an ISO of around 400, And that's because it has such a small sensor. Let's look at a graphic from one of your readings to understand why sensor size really matters. A smaller sensor crops your picture. The advantage is that you can use little tiny lenses to get a reasonable zoom range. This is why camera phones and point and shoots are small and pocketable. The outer bright orange rectangle on this photo would be the picture that we would get using a full frame sensor. The lighter orange that comes next is what we would get with an APS-C sensor, which is what are on most DSLRs. An APS-C sensor has a crop factor of 1.5. So a 100 millimeter lens on a full frame camera becomes a 150 millimeter lens on an APS-C camera. The blue rectangle represents the crop factor on most phones, including the iPhone 5. The crop factor is 7.61. Imagine taking a photo and cropping it down this much. This is why camera phones, bridge cameras, and point and shoots just can't compete with the DSLRs and mirrorless systems when it comes to image quality. They do okay in good light for still shots, but they're pretty bad in low light or action shots. The 12 megapixels on this Sony a7S full frame camera will beat the picture quality on a point and shoot, bridge camera, or camera phone any day, even if it has way more pixels. If you want a high-end interchangeable lens system that'll grow with you, either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera is fine. At this point in time, I'd give the nod to the mirrorless cameras because they're smaller and easier to use, and generally they take much better video. The advantages of the DSLR at this point in time is that they've usually got a much more extensive collection of lenses available. Mirrorless systems are fairly new and tend to have less native or lenses that are specifically made for that mount. They tend to have less native lenses available. However, one thing mirrorless systems can do that DSLRs can't is that you can usually buy a cheap adapter for mirrorless systems that'll let you use almost any kind of lens on it. So if you want to go out and buy some old high quality lenses that'll only shoot in manual mode, you can usually find an adapter that'll go with a particular lens system. You can put it on your mirrorless system and shoot with older lenses. This means that you can use almost any lens ever made on a mirrorless system. However, in most cases, there are some exceptions. In most cases, you lose the ability to autofocus and you have to use the camera in full manual mode. Now that's fine for landscapes and things like that, but it can be difficult for action shots. The next step down in the lineup is a bridge camera. And we'll define a bridge camera versus a point and shoot. This is kind of a hybrid, but it doesn't shoot in manual mode, so I'll still call it a point and shoot. It does have a lot of customizable functions on it. We'll define a bridge camera as one that has that mode dial and lets you shoot in manual mode, shutter priority mode, or aperture priority mode. The nice thing about a bridge camera is it can be a great all-in-one kind of camera. For example, with this, I can go from shooting very wide angle up to the equivalent of a 1200 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter camera equivalent. And we often talk about those equivalents when we're talking about digital cameras. We still compare things back to that old 35 millimeter format. So it can do that because it's got this small sensor, and because it's got such a small sensor, we have a large crop factor, which means a smaller lens brings things in a lot closer than it does on one of these cameras with a large sensor. So you get much more of a telephoto effect. There's a story behind why I bought this camera. I like to bicycle, and while out bike riding one day, I'm coming down a pretty steep hill, so I'm hitting about 30 miles an hour, and off in the distance I see something walking up the road. As I got a little closer, I realized it was a pretty good-sized bear. So I thought, not a good idea to pass a bear on a bicycle. So I stopped the bike, and at that point it was still pretty far away. and I watched it and I'm thinking, boy, I wish I had a camera with me that had a nice long lens on it. The bears came closer and closer. I probably could have gotten an okay shot with even, like a 70mm lens equivalent. At one point I started getting a little nervous and said, well, what happens if it keeps walking up the road towards me? I'm not going to be able to beat it going back up that hill. Do I try to go by it or what? And I had decided I was going to go off into a driveway, but it turned and it went into a meadow. Well, at that point I said, I need something to capture that kind of experience if it happens again. And I bought this camera to put in my bicycle bag, and it's got a really long lens on it. In fact, longer than the equivalent of my DSLR lenses, and if I use that lens, this is way smaller than my 600mm lens that would go with this. So we're talking a pretty heavy setup. This is a nice camera to take with me if I'm out hiking and want to do a little bird watching. I've gotten some pretty decent shots with it. And the other thing I've found is that even if the shot's a little fuzzy, I can often identify birds because I've gotten a nice still shot of it. So I like this camera for that specific purpose, but it really doesn't take nearly as nice pictures as my DSLR mirrorless systems. Although it does pretty well in daylight, and it's got that long lens, so I can get some pictures that I wouldn't have been able to get with these. So bridge cameras are great if you want kind of an all-in-one solution. If you want to mess with wildlife and getting in close, you're going to have to spend a few $1,000s to be able to get a DSLR and lens that'll do wildlife and birds. So this would be a fairly inexpensive solution to doing that. And it does a pretty good job. What you can't really do very well with it is crop down your pictures. You start to lose quality really quickly when you crop. Okay, the next couple cameras I have here are point and shoots. This one does have some ability to change your aperture, although it doesn't have the full manual settings on it, so it wouldn't work for the class. Great thing about this particular camera is it goes underwater. So this will go up to 50 feet underwater. So if I want to go snorkeling, if I want to go kayaking, canoeing, I'm going to be out on just a really wet day, this is the camera that I want to take with me. So again, it's really great for specific purposes. Point and shoot with basically no customizable functions. It works pretty much the same way as your cell phone. These things, they're useless nowadays. If you got a cell phone, there's no reason to have a basic point and shoot. If it doesn't go underwater, if it doesn't have some customizability, if it won't shoot in manual mode, you might as well use your phone. You should also check out the PowerPoint online, and that will give you some more comparisons between the various types of cameras. If you're thinking that you want to buy a digital camera, like I said, right now this Sony Nex-5T is a great camera. It's hard to find a new one, but you can find used ones on eBay, and you probably find one for $250, $300. It's a great way to go. Sony A5000, 5100, those are great cameras. You can sometimes find them on sale. Basic Canons and Nikons. I know a lot of people have the Nikon 32, 3300 series. That's a nice camera, it takes great pictures, but as with a lot of the lowest level Canons and Nikons, it doesn't have nearly as many features on it, and it's a bit more expensive than you can find one of these mirrorless cameras for. I find with the Nikons and Canons, they're great systems, but you have to go up to at least the second level to get all the features that you're going to want on. Picture quality is fine on the basic level. They just tend to lack features. I'm making this video for the fall 2015 semester, but I'm sure I'll use it for several semesters. Every semester I'll go through and look for the least expensive camera that you could use for this class, which will usually be a bridge camera, and then recommendations on interchangeable lens system cameras. I'll shoot out emails with a few of them. Usually I concentrate on the lower end system, the less expensive systems, because that's what college students can afford to buy. If you're looking at buying a higher end system, come in and talk to me. I love to talk about cameras. So come in and we'll talk about what would be specifically right for you. Different cameras work better for different people.